In the winter of 1876, a small wooden crate arrived at the Whittemore Ranch on the frozen plains of Montana. It was carefully packed, marked fragile, and carried with the kind of reverence usually reserved for something sacred. Inside lay a porcelain doll, a gift sent from Europe to Clara Whitmore, new bride and matriarch of a family already respected across the region. Clara unwrapped the figure with delicate hands. The doll's dress smelled faintly of rosewater, its silk hair tied into braids. Its porcelain face was pale, perfect, almost human. Yet what caught her breath was its eyes, glass, pale, unblinking. They reflected candlelight with a strange sharpness, too precise, too patient. Clara forced a smile, convincing herself it was only craftsmanship. Still, she felt the room grow heavier the moment it was placed on the mantel, as though the house itself had inhaled a presence it would never release. James Whittemore watched closely. To neighbors, he was generous and warm, a man of stature. In private, he was different, measured, calculating, always noting the smallest reactions. When Clara handed him the doll, he examined it, not with admiration but analysis. His finger traced its mouth, its seams, its lifeless hands. His smile was faint, but in his mind the doll was already more than a gift. It was a tool, perhaps even an accomplice. The courier who delivered it left quickly, shaken by something he couldn't explain. Later, he swore the doll's eyes had followed him out the door. The memory would linger with him for years, though he dared not speak of it aloud. In the weeks that followed, the doll became a fixture in the Whittemore home. At first, it was simply an ornament above the hearth. But gradually it began to intrude, brought to the dining table, placed in the parlor during lessons, positioned to face whoever entered the room. The daughters, still young, were drawn to it with a mixture of fascination and unease. They touched its cold hands, giggled nervously at its stiff form, but quickly fell quiet under its stare. Clara told herself it was harmless, that all children project feelings onto toys, yet she noticed how the atmosphere shifted whenever the doll was present. Conversations softened, laughter grew hesitant, and silence became the dominant language of the household. Even she found herself lowering her voice as if the doll could overhear. James encouraged its presence. He spoke of tradition, of the value of passing heirlooms between generations. But his eyes betrayed something else, a quiet satisfaction each time the girls fell silent beneath the doll's gaze. Alone in his study with the doll placed on the desk beside his ledger, he would write for hours. Notes, calculations, observations, he stared at it as if waiting for it to blink. No harm had yet been done. No punishment was carried out. Yet already the balance of the household had shifted. Fear had entered not with shouts or violence, but with stillness. An object too perfect, too watchful, too patient. Clara did not know it then, but the crate that arrived that winter had opened more than wood and straw. It had opened the first chapter of a long descent, one that would swallow her daughters, her home, and every shred of safety she thought the walls could provide. The doll had arrived, and nothing within the Whittemore house would ever be innocent again. The first child to inherit the doll's presence was Abigail, the eldest. Barely 4, she reached for it with curiosity, her small hands brushing its cold porcelain arms. She giggled, unaware of the unease settling into the room. To her, it was a toy. To her father, it was the beginning of something much darker. James stood silently in the doorway, observing the moment as though it were an experiment. He noted the delay before Abigail touched it, the hesitation in her fingers, the way her eyes lingered too long on its unblinking stare. Each detail was logged in his mind, a calculation of how fear could be shaped, how obedience could be drawn from silence. The doll became a constant presence. It was passed from Abigail to Sarah, then Elizabeth, and finally Ruth, the youngest. At first it appeared harmless, an heirloom shared between sisters, but it was never left in a trunk, never put away. It sat at the dining table, on the mantel, on the parlor floor, positioned so that it always faced one child or another. The girls grew used to eating beneath its gaze, completing chores while it watched, whispering their fears and thoughts into its unyielding stillness. Each daughter responded differently. Abigail became quieter, her bold voice reduced to whispers. Sarah bowed her head before the doll at night as though it could absorb her secrets. Elizabeth traced its dress nervously, confessing her fears in silence. Even Ruth, too young to understand, felt its pull. She spoke to it like a companion, though her tone carried more pleading than play. The changes did not escape Clara. She watched her daughters transform, their laughter replaced by caution, their voices by measured restraint. When she questioned James, he smiled gently and insisted the doll was a harmless tradition, a gift meant to strengthen discipline. Clara wanted to believe him, but the unease only deepened. She saw how quickly her children stilled in the doll's presence, how their eyes flicked toward it before answering questions as though it held authority greater than their parents. James encouraged this obedience. He would move the doll during meals, shifting its gaze from one daughter to another, waiting for the tremors in their hands or the falter in their voices. He never needed to raise his voice. The silence, coupled with the doll's stare, did the work for him. His ledger grew thick with observations, each entry a record of hesitation, failure, or compliance. What unsettled Clara most was how natural it all seemed. The doll was never spoken of as punishment, never acknowledged as anything but a family heirloom. Yet its presence suffocated the house. The girls anticipated judgment in its stare and corrected themselves before mistakes could form. The fear was quiet, but it was absolute. By the time Ruth was old enough to sit at the table, the doll had ceased to be a toy altogether. It was not touched without permission, not moved without consequence. It had become a permanent fixture, a member of the family, silent, patient, and inescapable. The children did not yet understand what James was building. They only knew that under the doll's unblinking gaze, their voices faltered, their laughter died, and their freedom shrank. Fear had entered their lives not through violence, but through ritualized stillness. And as James continued his notes in secret, the Whittemore daughters learned their first unspoken rule. Silence was survival. To the town of Helena, James Whittemore was a man of generosity and respect. He gave to neighbors in need, advised at church meetings, and carried himself with an air of quiet dignity. His smile was constant, calm, and reassuring. Yet inside his home, that same smile became something else entirely. A mask that concealed calculation. A signal that observation was never-ending. James's study was his sanctuary. The doll always sat nearby, perched on his desk beside a thick ledger. Page by page, he documented the smallest details of his daughters' lives. The time it took them to complete chores, the pitch of their voices, the hesitation in their eyes when they lied. He treated them not as children, but as subjects in a private experiment. Their behavior was dissected with the precision of a scholar, each entry in the ledger a piece of data in his growing system of control. In public, he praised them with warmth, but in private, discipline came through subtler means. A tilt of his head, a pause before he turned a page, a glance toward the doll that sat in silence beside them. His daughters quickly understood that mistakes did not need scolding. The weight of his gaze paired with the porcelain eyes of the doll was enough to make their stomachs twist. Fear had become invisible yet omnipresent. Clara noticed the difference most of all. Abigail, once bold, now avoided speaking unless prompted. Sarah, who once laughed freely, spoke in measured tones as if each word was weighed before leaving her mouth. Elizabeth developed a nervous habit of wringing her hands, her gaze flicking constantly toward the doll. Even Ruth, the youngest, grew quiet in her play, her laughter dying in her throat when James entered the room. The house had become subdued, every corner saturated with unspoken rules. When Clara voiced her concerns, James only smiled, his words smooth and gentle. "Children need discipline," he said, "and discipline begins with attention." His answers left no space for argument. Still, Clara saw what others could not: his obsession with silence, his delight in the way fear reshaped his daughters. More and more often she found him in his study long after midnight, pen scratching against the ledger, eyes fixed on the doll as if it were listening to every calculation. For the daughters, his smile became its own language. A small curve of his lips meant approval. A wider, colder grin meant something had been noted, written down, stored against them. They moved through their days with this knowledge lodged deep in their minds, correcting themselves before errors could manifest. It was not punishment that frightened them. It was anticipation, the certainty that nothing went unnoticed. The doll's role was subtle but vital. Placed strategically in each room, it transformed ordinary moments into tests of endurance. A misplaced utensil, a spill of water, a glance too long at the window. Every act seemed magnified under its unblinking stare. James rarely needed to intervene. The doll did the work for him, a silent extension of his control. By the end of that year, the Whittemore daughters had changed. They spoke less, moved carefully, and lived as though constantly on trial. Clara's voice trembled whenever she addressed her husband, sensing the depth of his obsession but powerless to confront it. James's smile never faltered, but behind it lay a mind refining its methods, pushing his family into a system where fear was not just felt, it was lived. The father's smile was never warm. It was a warning, and under that smile the house had already begun to rot from the inside. Winter returned harsh and unforgiving, snow sealing the Whittemore ranch in near isolation. Inside, the house was quieter than ever. Abigail, the eldest, had grown pale and subdued, her once bright voice replaced by whispers. She seemed to move carefully through each room, her eyes always flicking toward the doll as though seeking its approval. Then, without warning, she was gone. At first, Clara believed she had wandered outside. Tracks in the snow led toward the creek, but faded before reaching the water. Neighbors helped search, combing the frozen land with lanterns, yet no trace was found. When questioned, James recited her daily routine with unnerving precision, describing what she wore, where she had last stood, even the way her hair had been braided that morning. His voice was calm, steady, almost rehearsed. His composure unsettled Clara, but no one in town dared question it. Days stretched into weeks, and Abigail was never found. Whispers circulated among neighbors, but the official story became an accident, lost in the snow, taken by the elements. Only inside the house did the truth feel heavier. Clara noticed James writing more often in his ledger, pages filled with notes she was not permitted to read. His smile was the same as always, but now it seemed sharper, colder, as though Abigail's disappearance had confirmed something he had long anticipated. The remaining daughters reacted with quiet dread. Sarah clutched the doll tightly at night, whispering to it as if it might protect her. Elizabeth grew jittery, refusing to walk the halls alone. Ruth, too young to fully understand, began to cry whenever left near the parlor, her small body trembling beneath the doll's unblinking eyes. Clara tried to comfort them, but her presence was frail, her strength diminished by fear. She sensed that James's experiment had advanced, that Abigail's absence was not misfortune but design. James offered no explanations, but his actions spoke clearly. He adjusted the doll's place at the table, ensuring its gaze fell on one daughter, then another. He continued recording their reactions, their hesitations, their trembling hands. There was no direct punishment, no raised voice. Instead, the absence of Abigail hung like a warning, a silence that carried more power than words. The lesson was clear. Mistakes did not need correction. They could simply end in disappearance. Clara's grief remained locked behind her lips. To question James openly felt dangerous, to confront him impossible. Yet she saw in his calm eyes a certainty that terrified her. The certainty of a man convinced that fear itself was the purest form of obedience. The house no longer needed shouting or violence. It needed only silence, and silence had claimed Abigail as its first offering. By the end of that winter, the Whittemore home had changed forever. Meals were eaten without laughter, chores performed without hesitation, and the daughters spoke as little as possible. Clara moved through her days as though sleepwalking, her mind filled with unanswered questions she dared not ask. And always at the center of the house, the doll sat upright, glass eyes gleaming in the firelight, a mute witness to the first silence that had swallowed a child whole. Abigail was gone, and though her name would fade from the townspeople's lips, within the house she remained, a phantom etched into every glance at the doll, every line in James's ledger, every whisper that died before it could be spoken. After Abigail's disappearance, the house sank into a silence so deep it seemed to breathe. James used that silence as material, shaping it into lessons. He no longer needed to threaten or punish openly. Fear had already hollowed the children. What he required now were experiments, small but deliberate, designed to measure how far obedience could be pushed before it broke. Sarah became the first subject. James told her it was a game. She was to stay in the pantry behind the heavy wooden door until she could prove she had mastered quiet. At first she whispered to herself, humming softly to fight the fear. But hours passed and the air thickened. When Clara opened the door, Sarah's lips were blue, her body stiff with exhaustion. James took notes in his ledger, recording the number of hours she had endured before sound returned. Elizabeth's trial was different. She was told to confess her thoughts to the doll before meals. At first she recited childish fears, shadows, creaks in the walls. But soon the confessions became desperate. She whispered apologies for things she had not done, terrified that unspoken mistakes would appear in the ledger anyway. The doll's porcelain face remained unmoved, but James listened closely, writing each word. He was not interested in the truth. He was interested in how quickly guilt could be manufactured under pressure. Ruth, still young, was given the cruelest test of all. She was instructed to hold her breath underwater in a trough behind the barn while her father counted. She surfaced gasping after a few seconds, but James simply placed the doll on the edge, its glass eyes fixed downward, and told her to try again. Each attempt lasted longer, the fear of disappointing both father and doll forcing her past instinct. Clara intervened once, pulling her daughter from the water, but James's smile silenced her. "Discipline builds endurance," he said, returning to his ledger. Clara herself was not spared. She was told to remain in the parlor for hours without speaking, the doll positioned inches from her face. Her throat burned from the restraint, but she endured in silence, fearing that any sound would be marked as failure. She realized then that her husband's cruelty was no longer discipline. It was science, an ongoing study in how silence could break or reshape a person. What made these lessons more terrifying was their invisibility. There were no bruises to show, no screams to alert the neighbors. The cruelty existed in stillness, in the suffocating quiet of the pantry, the forced confessions to porcelain ears, the water closing over a child's face. James's experiments left no marks except in the mind, where fear and obedience became indistinguishable. By the end of that season, the daughters had changed again. Sarah walked more softly, Elizabeth whispered even when no one was near, and Ruth flinched at the sight of water. Clara moved through the house like a ghost, each step measured, each breath restrained. And always, James wrote in his ledger, his smile unwavering, his hands steady, his doll perched nearby as if silently approving. The experiments in silence had succeeded. The house no longer needed voices, it needed only silence. And silence was the language James had perfected. By the following winter, Clara began to notice strange details about the doll. At first, it was nothing more than hairline cracks along its mouth, faint lines she dismissed as wear. But one morning, as she wiped dust from its porcelain face, her cloth came away streaked with red. She froze, staring at the jagged edge of its small teeth. It looked as though the doll itself had bitten something, or someone. James explained it away with ease. "A scratch in the glaze," he said calmly, though his eyes lingered on Clara's trembling hand. But Clara could not shake the dread. That evening, Sarah's lips were swollen, her tongue marked with tiny cuts. She refused to explain, but Clara soon understood the truth. Her husband had made the doll part of his lessons. James's new ritual was grotesque. Before meals, the daughters were told to kneel before the doll and press their tongues against its teeth. It was, he insisted, an act of discipline, a sacrament of silence. The porcelain edges split tender flesh, drawing small beads of blood. No daughter dared refuse. Clara watched in horror as Sarah winced, Elizabeth whimpered, and Ruth's mouth filled with crimson. James recorded it all in his ledger, satisfied with the control he had engineered. The ritual deepened over time. If a child faltered during chores, she was brought to the parlor and forced to kneel until she complied. If hesitation lingered, the doll's teeth awaited her. The fear of that bite, cold, sharp, and humiliating, soon became enough to silence any protest. The doll was no longer a symbol. It was an active participant, an extension of James's will. Clara's protests were useless. James listened with his usual smile, then placed the doll in front of her, demanding she hold her tongue between its teeth for an hour. Her mouth bled, her jaw trembled, but she complied. That night she lay awake, tasting iron, realizing what she had denied for years. The doll was not cursed. It carried no supernatural force. It was her husband who had turned it into an altar of pain, and her children were being sacrificed upon it piece by piece. The daughters learned quickly. They spoke less, obeyed more, and avoided the doll's gaze whenever possible. Yet it was everywhere, on the mantel, on the table, in the study, always watching, always ready. Sarah developed a stammer, Elizabeth chewed her lips raw, and Ruth whimpered in her sleep. Their childhoods were dissolving into silence and blood, measured and orchestrated by a father who believed fear could be perfected. By spring, Clara no longer saw her daughters as children, but as subjects in an experiment she could not stop. And the doll, once a gift meant to bring joy, had become a weapon. Each time she passed it in the parlor, she swore its cracked mouth looked wider, as if feeding on the suffering it oversaw. But she knew the truth. It was not the porcelain that bit. It was James. The doll was only the mask he wore. By midsummer, the Whittemore house had begun to feel alive in ways that defied reason. The girls spoke less of Abigail, yet her absence was palpable, haunting the corridors like a ghost tethered to memory. Each room carried an echo of fear, a residual tension that neither sunlight nor routine could dissipate. The walls themselves seemed to murmur subtle vibrations beneath the surface of ordinary domestic sounds. The daughters noticed it first in the quiet of night, the creaks of floorboards, the groans of timber, the faint sighing of the wind against the siding. But gradually, the noises began to feel more deliberate, purposeful, as if someone or something was listening, communicating, observing. It was Elizabeth who first vocalized the dread. Sitting alone by the parlor window, she spoke softly to herself, trying to parse the sensations she could not name. "It's like the house knows," she whispered, pressing her hands to her ears as if to block the sounds. Sarah, in a rare moment of defiance, shook her head and claimed it was imagination. Yet even she could not deny the sensation of being watched from every angle. The doll's presence amplified the effect. Its unblinking gaze seemed to extend beyond the room, integrating with the house itself, the walls conduits for observation and judgment. Fear had seeped into the architecture, entwined with the daughter's perception until reality itself felt contaminated. James watched all of this with calculated restraint. He had no need to speak. The walls, the house, the doll, all had become instruments in the amplification of his power. He walked the halls silently, observing reactions, noting posture, pulse, and hesitation. The ledger, kept hidden but ever present, expanded with meticulous records of each subtle tremor, each swallow, each glance toward the corners where shadows lingered longest. The second lesson had cemented compliance. The third, unfolding now, would convert compliance into preemptive fear, making obedience instinctive and thoughtless. The whispers themselves were never clearly defined. At times they were faint, like the rustling of paper or the sigh of a settling beam. At other times they seemed to form words, half-heard phrases that hinted at secrets, threats, and unspoken consequences. Ruth, already fragile from constant surveillance, began to flinch at every whisper, tilting her head as if to catch the source. Clara, too, noticed a tightening in the house, a low hum that resonated in her chest when she passed certain doorways. The daughters could no longer distinguish between the ordinary creaks of a house and the calculated messages embedded in the silence. The environment itself had become an extension of James's control, a psychological trap as precise as any instrument he might have wielded. Late one night, Elizabeth dared to touch the walls, pressing her hand against the plaster where a faint vibration seemed to pulse. She felt warmth, almost imperceptible, beneath her palm and recoiled in terror. Sarah approached to investigate, and together they traced a series of subtle movements in the structure, small indentations and traces that suggested someone or something had been there, observing, shaping their perception. They were not alone in their fear. The house had been transformed into a vessel for James's will, a silent accomplice echoing the dread he wished to instill. By now the daughters had internalized the principle. Observation alone could dictate behavior more effectively than physical punishment. The whispers in the walls, whether real or imagined, reinforced the lesson. They began to anticipate judgment, modifying every action in advance, performing each task with mechanical precision. Meals were prepared with exacting care, chores completed without error, and even the smallest facial expression was monitored and corrected internally. The doll remained the constant, a silent anchor in the midst of the shifting psychological landscape, a repository for fear that extended into the walls themselves. Clara, already weary from months of surveillance and small, controlled punishments, began to sense a creeping inevitability. The house had become a psychological prison, its architecture merged with the will of a man whose cruelty required no overt violence. The whispers, the creaks, the doll, and the ledger had created a feedback loop, amplifying dread until the daughters moved through their days as shadows of themselves, eyes flicking toward corners, hands trembling at imagined infractions. The methodical mind of James Whittemore had engineered an environment where thought itself became a liability, where fear extended beyond observation into the very walls, shaping perception, behavior, and ultimately survival. As night fell, the girls would gather near the parlor, silent and watchful, aware that the next lesson could arrive at any moment. The house, the doll, and the whispers had merged into a single, omnipresent force. The daughters understood in a way they could not articulate that obedience was no longer optional. It was instinctive, internalized, unavoidable. And in that realization lay the true horror. The house had become a laboratory of control, the whispers a weapon, and the daughters unwilling participants in a meticulous study of fear, observation, and psychological domination. By midsummer, the carefully cultivated order of the Whittemore household was beginning to show cracks. The first two daughters had internalized the lessons, their movements measured, their thoughts filtered through the ever-present lens of fear. But the third daughter, Ruth, was different. Slight, perceptive, and quietly defiant in ways the others had long since abandoned, she possessed a flicker of awareness that threatened the carefully constructed system of control. James had noticed this from the start, cataloging her glances, her hesitations, her subtle pauses, each entry in the ledger more detailed than any he had recorded for the others. Ruth's defiance was not loud or reckless. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, a reluctance to bow entirely to the mechanisms of fear. Where her sisters recoiled at the faintest whisper in the walls or the porcelain gaze of the doll, Ruth would stare back, head tilted, eyes narrowing, testing the limits of observation itself. James responded not with overt punishment but with escalation, subtle and precise, designed to teach Ruth the danger of thought unrestrained by fear. He introduced a new ritual, an evening of reflection, by candlelight, in which the daughters were instructed to recount every misstep, real or imagined, before the doll. Sarah and Clara complied with mechanical precision, their voices low and trembling. Ruth hesitated, a single heartbeat of resistance, and James's eyes lingered, noting the deviation. That hesitation was the spark. In the following days, Ruth's tasks were intensified, measured not only in difficulty but in the psychological stakes. She was assigned to clean the study, a room filled with glass jars, ledger entries, and intricate instruments. Each action, dusting, polishing, arranging, was scrutinized, the doll positioned to record even the slightest tremor in her hands. When a single jar tipped, rattling faintly against the others, Ruth froze, aware of the invisible consequences. James did not speak. He did not need to. The air thickened with expectation, the house itself leaning toward observation, and Ruth understood that her defiance had already been noted and would be addressed with a precision that would leave no room for doubt. That night, the lesson escalated. James summoned Ruth to the parlor where the doll sat as always, its gaze unnervingly direct. On the table lay an assortment of implements, none immediately dangerous, but each symbolizing potential harm. Tiny steel tools, pins, and thin wires arranged with meticulous care. He instructed her to perform a task she had never seen before, threading the wire through a series of small holes in the doll's base without leaving a single mark. It was a test of focus, patience, and terror. The room remained silent, the other daughters withdrawn into obedient shadows. Ruth's hands shook slightly as she began, aware that every slip, every miscalculation was recorded, evaluated, and would influence her next phase of instruction. Hours passed. Ruth's fingers bled slightly from repeated contact with the wire, a silent witness to her growing anxiety. The doll's gaze never wavered, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, almost watching in tandem. Ruth's internal struggle was visible in every motion, fear battling defiance, instinct battling obedience. She was learning that survival required precision, but the instinct to resist had not yet been extinguished. The tension was almost unbearable. Every second stretched into an eternity, and yet Ruth continued, silently enduring, silently resisting. By dawn, the task was complete. The wire threaded flawlessly, the surface unmarred, the challenge met, but not without cost. Ruth's hands were raw, her body tense, and her mind exhausted from the constant vigilance that James had imposed. The lesson was clear. Defiance could be managed, but only through absolute focus, unwavering attention, and endurance of fear until it became second nature. The third daughter had survived the trial, but the price had been steep. Even as she returned to her duties, Ruth felt the change within herself. She was no longer merely cautious. She was hyper-aware, calculating, constantly anticipating consequences. The house, the whispers, and the doll had become extensions of James's will, instruments in the shaping of obedience. But beneath the surface, a small ember remained, an internal resistance that had been recognized, documented, and challenged. The third daughter had been tested, marked, and measured. She had survived, but her survival had made her more aware than ever of the mechanisms of control surrounding her. The stage was now set for the next phase of lessons, where observation, defiance, and fear would collide in ways none of the daughters could yet anticipate. By late summer, the ledger had become more than a book. It was a living testament to James Whitmore's control, a meticulous record of fear, compliance, and failure. Each daughter's actions, hesitations, and even fleeting thoughts had been catalogued with relentless precision. The pages, dense with ink, traced the minute fluctuations of behavior. How Ruth's fingers trembled, how Sarah's eyes darted to corners, how Clara's lips compressed at imagined infractions. The ledger was both weapon and mirror, reflecting the daughter's internalized dread and shaping it in ways more absolute than any physical punishment could achieve. James now invited the daughters to witness the ledger in detail. In the parlor, he laid it open on the table beneath the dim glow of a single lantern. Its pages were filled with grids, symbols, and annotations that seemed meaningless at first glance. But under James's guidance, the method became horrifyingly clear. Each mark corresponded to a mistake, a hesitation, or a lapse in obedience. The daughters could see the accumulation of their errors in a system they could not escape. Even an imagined misstep had weight. Even an unspoken thought could be recorded and measured. The ledger transformed abstract fear into tangible proof, a methodical and inescapable instrument of psychological torment. Ruth, who had already tested the boundaries of defiance, was first to be confronted. James flipped to her section, pointing to a series of symbols that denoted the smallest errors. The trembling of her hand while threading the doll's wire, the hesitation before responding to instructions, the momentary glance toward the corner where shadows lingered. Each mark represented not only a record but also a consequence, real or implied. Ruth's chest tightened, her heartbeat rising in silent panic. The ledger was no longer merely observation. It was judgment, execution, and forecast. The methodical mind of James had converted her behavior into a form of currency, and the debt owed was measured in fear, endurance, and compliance. The other daughters watched in silence, understanding that their own marks might be scrutinized next. Sarah's section of the ledger revealed minor deviations. A missed alignment of a utensil, a delayed response, a glance that lingered too long. Clara's pages were similarly populated, a tapestry of minor imperfections woven into an endless narrative of discipline. The ledger's authority was total. It confirmed what the walls, the doll, and the whispers had already suggested. Obedience was mandatory, observation absolute, and failure both quantifiable and unforgiving. James explained the ledger's purpose calmly, with the precision of a scholar presenting a complex theorem. Each mark, he said, voice measured, represents an opportunity for correction. To survive here, you must anticipate judgment, correct error before it manifests, and integrate observation into thought itself. The ledger teaches, the ledger shapes, the ledger is final. The daughters absorbed the lesson with mechanical attention, realizing that the ledger had already achieved its objective. Fear had become instinctive. Every gesture, every thought, and every hesitation was now filtered through the inevitability of observation and consequence. What made the ledger truly harrowing was its permanence. Each daughter understood that the record was cumulative and enduring. Mistakes were never erased, never forgiven. They would carry them forward, invisible chains that dictated posture, motion, and thought. Even when James left the room, the ledger's presence was palpable. Its pages, dense with symbols and corrections, haunted the daughters in silence, extending control beyond immediate supervision into the realm of private consciousness. The house, the whispers, the doll, and now the ledger formed a network of psychological domination, a system of surveillance and judgment that left no corner of thought untouched. By nightfall, the daughters had internalized the ledger's lesson. Their movements were more precise, their eyes more calculating, their thoughts more guarded. Ruth, whose defiance had once sparked subtle rebellion, now moved with hyper-awareness, her mind attuned to the smallest infraction. Fear had become anticipation, dread had become preemptive compliance, and the ledger, silent yet omnipresent, ensured that every action, no matter how trivial, was weighed, measured, and recorded. In the dim light of the parlor, the daughters remained still, shadows lengthened by the flickering lantern, each acutely aware that the ledger had transformed observation into absolute authority. Mistakes, however minor, had tangible consequences, and survival demanded perfection. The third daughter had been tested, documented, and corrected, and the lessons of the ledger had become indelible. In that quiet, oppressive hour, the full weight of James Whitmore's methodology pressed upon them. Control was not enacted solely through fear of immediate harm, but through the slow, unrelenting architecture of observation, record, and judgment. Autumn crept over the Montana plains, and with it came a new stage in James Whitmore's campaign of control. By now, the ledger, the whispers, and the doll had bound the daughters in a web of fear so taut that even silence was heavy with meaning. Yet James's mind was not satisfied with obedience alone. He sought perfection, a refinement of discipline that could not be measured by ordinary tests. Thus began what he called the unseen test, an experiment designed not to evaluate action in plain sight, but to shape behavior when no one appeared to be watching. It began subtly. James announced no lesson, issued no instructions. Instead, he withdrew, leaving the daughters in rooms with the doll positioned discreetly, its porcelain gaze fixed but unaccompanied by his immediate presence. The girls knew instinctively that their actions still mattered, that the ledger would somehow reflect even what James had not witnessed with his own eyes. The tension of those hours was unbearable. Every small movement, every step across the parlor, every touch of the table felt weighted with invisible consequence. They did not understand how he would know, only that he would. And in that uncertainty, fear expanded beyond the visible into the invisible, colonizing thought itself. Sarah was the first to falter. Believing herself unobserved, she lingered too long by the window, eyes fixed on the shifting trees outside, a moment of distraction stolen from the constant vigilance. Hours later, the ledger bore a new mark beside her name. James offered no explanation, no confrontation, only a faint nod and a calm notation. The message was unmistakable. Even unspoken thoughts, even fleeting lapses were subject to surveillance. There was no refuge from observation. The test was unseen, but the consequences were real. Elizabeth, too, succumbed. In the stillness of the night, she whispered a prayer to herself, pleading for deliverance. She thought it was quiet enough, hidden beneath her breath, swallowed by the walls. Yet the next day, James looked upon her with that same measured smile and turned a page in the ledger where a fresh mark awaited her. Elizabeth's face was drained of color. The prayer had been heard. The doll's unblinking eyes had recorded it. The walls had whispered it. The house itself had become an accomplice in the act of control. She understood now that resistance was not only punished but anticipated, caught before it had the chance to manifest. Ruth faced the test differently. She sensed its purpose, its trap. She moved with calculated restraint, suppressing every instinct, every flicker of expression. But even in her precision, she felt the weight of the invisible. The unseen test was not designed merely to catch mistakes. It was meant to erode thought itself, to replace individuality with constant anticipation of judgment. Ruth felt herself fracturing, her defiance shrinking beneath the enormity of a system that demanded not just obedience of action, but obedience of mind. Clara, exhausted and hollowed by years of silent complicity, began to recognize the full horror of James's design. The unseen test was not about the daughters alone. It was about creating an atmosphere where fear was inescapable, where the boundary between external authority and internal thought collapsed entirely. The doll, once a gift, had become the instrument of that collapse. Its gaze extended into the unseen, colonizing every corner of the mind, ensuring that even solitude offered no reprieve. Clara realized with a sinking dread that her husband's genius lay not in punishment but in creating a system where punishment was no longer necessary. The daughters were shaping themselves, disciplining themselves, becoming instruments of his will without his direct intervention. By winter's first frost, the daughters had changed irrevocably. Their movements were sharper, their voices almost absent, their faces pale with constant vigilance. The unseen test had succeeded. Fear had expanded beyond the visible into the invisible, beyond the spoken into the unspoken, until the line between thought and compliance had dissolved. James's ledger recorded fewer mistakes now, not because perfection had been achieved, but because imperfection itself had been buried beneath a suffocating silence. The unseen test marked the turning point. The Whittemore house was no longer merely a place of observation and judgment. It had become a crucible of psychological annihilation, a place where the very act of existing required submission to invisible authority. And at the center of it all, the doll remained silent and unblinking, a porcelain witness to the erasure of innocence and the triumph of methodical cruelty. The first snow of winter fell heavy across the Montana plains, muffling sound and sealing the Whittemore household in silence. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating, the weight of months of unseen tests pressing down on every member of the family. Sarah and Elizabeth moved like specters, their voices faint, their gestures stripped of individuality. Ruth, though still defiant in some small corner of her heart, was visibly trembling under the constant vigilance. Even Clara had grown brittle, her hands perpetually clasped, her eyes downcast. The house was no longer a home, but a chamber of endurance, and the breaking point was near. James sensed it. He measured it in the sharpness of his daughter's movements, in the way their eyes darted toward the doll as though seeking impossible mercy. His ledger had fewer entries now, but this did not mean success. It meant fear had consumed them so fully that even thought had been stifled. For James, this was progress, but progress in his mind demanded escalation. A system could not remain stagnant. It had to evolve. And so he devised a new trial, one that would drive them past endurance, to the edge where obedience would either shatter or become permanent. The trial was deceptively simple. One evening, he gathered the daughters in the cellar, a space colder, darker, and more oppressive than the rest of the house. The doll sat on a stool at the far end, its porcelain face pale against the lamplight. In front of it, James placed 3 chairs. He instructed the daughters to sit, hands folded, back straight, eyes fixed on the doll. They were to remain there in silence until he returned. He gave no indication of how long that would be. Then, without another word, he ascended the stairs, the heavy door closing behind him. At first, the silence was manageable. The girls sat rigid, hearts pounding, the cold biting at their skin. But as the hours stretched, the cellar seemed to contract, the air thickening, the shadows pulsing with imagined whispers. Ruth's small body began to shake uncontrollably. Sarah's lips quivered with suppressed cries, and Elizabeth's eyes glossed over with tears that never fell. The doll, unblinking, seemed almost alive in its patience, recording each tremor, each faltering breath. Time lost meaning. Hunger gnawed at them, thirst cracked their lips, and the cold seeped deep into their bones. Sarah was the first to falter. Her body slumped forward, a faint whimper escaping her throat. Immediately, Elizabeth stiffened, as if by absorbing her sister's failure she might stave off her own. Ruth, exhausted, clenched her fists, her defiance flickering weakly against the tide of despair. They did not know whether James was listening above, whether the ledger was being filled in real time, or whether the doll itself was transmitting their weakness. What they did know, with crushing certainty, was that failure would not go unnoticed. Hours became a day. Their bodies sagged, their minds drifted in and out of clarity. Ruth eventually tried to rise, desperate to escape, but Sarah pulled her back down, whispering frantically that it was worse to resist. The cellar had become a battlefield between survival and obedience, and in that crucible, something inside them began to fracture. By the time James returned, nearly 48 hours had passed. He opened the door calmly, his smile measured, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The daughters sat broken, their faces pale, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. He praised their endurance in a tone so gentle it cut deeper than any reprimand. He recorded their performance in the ledger, noting Ruth's attempted rebellion, Sarah's collapse, and Elizabeth's stoic compliance. Then he dismissed them with the air of a teacher concluding a lesson, as though they were not children but subjects in a study whose results had been carefully observed. The breaking point had been reached. The daughters were no longer simply obedient. They were hollowed, their individuality stripped, their resistance ground into near nothingness. Even Ruth, who had clung to defiance, now moved with the reflexive precision of one who knew resistance would only prolong suffering. Clara wept silently when she saw them return, but she dared not speak. She knew now that James's cruelty was not limited to action. His genius lay in pushing them past their natural limits, ensuring that even survival itself felt like a failure, a compromise with the inescapable system of fear he had built. That winter, the Whittemore household grew quieter still. The girls spoke rarely, moved mechanically, and avoided each other's eyes. The doll remained at the center of it all, a symbol of judgment, an eternal observer of their ruin. And James, satisfied yet restless, continued to refine his methods, searching for the next lesson that would etch fear even deeper into the marrow of his family's existence. By the winter of 1880, only Ruth remained. Sarah and Elizabeth had faded into silence, their bodies buried beneath the weight of obedience until they were little more than shadows. Their deaths were never spoken of openly, their absence explained away to neighbors with excuses of illness and frailty. In truth, they had withered under the weight of endless lessons, their spirits extinguished in a house that had long since abandoned the possibility of innocence. Clara, shattered and brittle, carried the grief like a stone lodged in her chest, but her voice was gone, her power stripped from her by years of calculated cruelty. That left Ruth, the final daughter, the last subject in James Whitmore's unrelenting experiment. Ruth was 13 by then, her body small but wiry, her eyes too knowing for a child. She had endured more than her sisters, had learned to anticipate judgment, to calculate consequences before mistakes could form. Yet within her, the ember of resistance still glowed faintly, a stubborn refusal to surrender completely. James recognized this ember, and it fascinated him. He had spent years grinding the others into obedience, but Ruth's resilience represented something different, an opportunity to refine his system to perfection, to erase resistance so completely that the very concept would no longer exist. The trial began with the doll. James had it placed not on the mantel or table, but strapped to Ruth herself. Its porcelain arms were fastened with iron clamps, binding its stiff hands to her wrists. Its face rested inches from her own, unblinking, a mirror of her every expression. She could not move without its presence, could not breathe without inhaling the scent of its varnished dress, could not turn her eyes without finding them caught in its glassy stare. The doll was no longer a witness. It was an extension of her body, a parasite fused to her existence, its silent gaze now inescapable. Ruth endured the binding for days. She slept with it, ate with it, and performed every chore with its weight pressing against her arms. Her sisters had once whispered of the doll's cruelty, but now Ruth bore its presence physically, carrying the embodiment of her father's authority with every step. Her arms ached from the strain, her skin bruised beneath the clamps, but worse than the pain was the intimacy of the doll's face, its silence pressing against her own, its glass eyes reflecting her fear back into her soul. Clara wept when she saw her youngest so bound, but she had no strength left to intervene. Years of endurance had broken her, and she lived now only as an echo of the woman she once was. James, meanwhile, watched with fascination, noting every shift in Ruth's demeanor, every faltering step, every moment her eyes betrayed exhaustion. He saw in her not only his daughter but a subject, the final piece in a grand study of fear, compliance, and the annihilation of resistance. The ledger filled with symbols and notes, each line documenting her slow descent. But Ruth was not her sister. Though weakened and trembling, she held tightly to that last ember of defiance. One night, when the house had gone still and James had retired to his study, she sat alone in the parlor with the doll still strapped to her arms. The firelight flickered across its porcelain face, and something inside her snapped. With a sudden, violent motion, she swung her bound arms against the stone hearth. The doll's head cracked with a sickening sound, shards of porcelain scattering across the floor. The clamps bit into her flesh, cutting deep. But she swung again and again until the doll's face was nothing but fragments. Blood from her wrists mingled with the dust of shattered porcelain, staining the floor in a grotesque blend of flesh and artifact. The noise drew James instantly. His calm smile broke into a mask of fury as he seized Ruth, striking her with a force she had never felt before. She collapsed to the floor, dazed, the remnants of the doll still clattering around her. For the first time in years, his system of control had been ruptured. The perfect witness was destroyed, the symbol of obedience shattered. James's ledger could not record this moment as a mere error. It was open rebellion. And in his rage, he made his fatal mistake. Clara, long silent, long broken, seized her chance. She slipped into the kitchen, hands trembling, and returned with a vial she had hidden for months. A tincture of poison acquired in secret. As James forced Ruth to her knees before the shattered doll, Clara poured the liquid into his supper, her face blank, her heart pounding. That night, James Whittemore sat to eat, his fury subsiding into the calm routine of evening. Minutes later, his breath grew ragged, his body convulsed, and he collapsed across the table. The ledger lay open before him, his last entries incomplete. Ruth survived, bruised and scarred, the doll's fragments still embedded in her skin. Clara buried James in the cellar where her daughters already rested, placing the broken porcelain atop his grave as if crowning him with the symbol of his own cruelty. The final daughter had lived, but the house would never again feel like a place of safety. When James Whitmore's body was lowered into the cellar laid among the shallow graves of his own daughters, silence fell across the ranch like a permanent shroud. Clara pressed the broken fragments of the doll into the soil above him, porcelain shards glinting in the lantern light like jagged teeth. She did not weep. Her tears had been exhausted long before. Instead, she stood hollow and trembling, a woman who had sacrificed everything to end a reign of control that had consumed her children and nearly destroyed the last spark of herself. Ruth, the final daughter, watched in silence, her wrists still raw from the clamps, her body trembling from weeks of torment. The Whittemore house no longer belonged to either of them. It belonged to memory, to fear, to the bones hidden beneath its floors. For a time, Clara and Ruth lived together in uneasy quiet. The routines of the household, once dictated by James's ledger and the gaze of the doll, now felt unbearable. Meals were consumed without words, chores performed with mechanical precision even though there was no longer anyone to record mistakes. Fear lingered as a habit. Even without the doll's presence, the daughters of James Whittemore had been trained to live in silence, to anticipate judgment where none existed. Clara noticed the way Ruth flinched at creaking floorboards, the way she avoided mirrors and windows, the way her eyes darted as though the porcelain gaze still followed her. The legacy of James was not buried with him. It lingered in Ruth's very posture, in the marrow of her bones. As months passed, rumors began to stir in the nearby town. Abigail's disappearance, followed by Sarah's and Elizabeth's, had already drawn suspicion years before, but Clara's increasing isolation fed the whispers. Neighbors noticed that she rarely left the ranch, and when she did, she moved like a woman half dead, eyes cast downward, voice strained with exhaustion. The ranch itself grew infamous, a place children avoided on their way to school, a house said to hold restless spirits, a parlor window where a pale face was sometimes seen even when no one lived inside. Ruth eventually fled, leaving the ranch behind as a hollow monument. She carried no possessions, no heirlooms, not even a scrap of the doll that had defined her childhood. She disappeared into the anonymity of distant towns, her name altered, her history buried. She never spoke of her father, never confessed to the horrors she had survived. To her, survival meant silence, and silence was the only lesson James had succeeded in teaching too well. Clara remained alone. She withered in the empty house, wandering its halls as if awaiting judgment. She kept the ledger locked in James's study but never destroyed it. She could not bring herself to open it either, as though the weight of those recorded mistakes could still crush her. When she died years later, her body was discovered at the base of the cellar steps, a lantern extinguished beside her. The townsfolk buried her quietly, but the ranch itself was left to rot, abandoned and avoided, a scar on the landscape. In 1912, decades after the final daughter had vanished, construction crews arrived to clear the land for new settlement. They found the bones beneath the cellar, tiny skeletons wrapped in decayed fabric, objects arranged in ritual patterns, and the broken remains of a porcelain doll still stained with dried blood. The discovery shocked the community, sparking whispers of curses, of madness, of secrets buried in silence. The remains were collected, but no memorial was raised, no names recorded in public record. The Whittemore family faded into history as an unspoken shame, a story told in hushed tones, a warning for children to obey their parents or risk vanishing into the same silence. Yet the legacy of James Whittemore extended beyond his house and his ledger. His cruelty became a cautionary tale in local sermons, woven into discussions of discipline, authority, and the dangers of silence. Laws began to shift slowly, spurred by the whispers of what had been uncovered. Calls for oversight of children's welfare, quiet debates about the boundaries of discipline. Though no one spoke his name openly, his shadow lingered in policy, in fear, in the recognition that evil could hide in plain sight, behind a smile, behind a doll, behind the image of a family respected by all. The Whittemore Ranch eventually collapsed into ruin, reclaimed by weeds and silence. Travelers passing by reported strange sensations, the feeling of being watched, the sound of faint whispers in the walls, the glint of porcelain shards buried in the soil. Perhaps it was memory, perhaps superstition. But for those who knew, or thought they knew the truth, it was a reminder. Evil does not vanish with the death of a man. It lingers in silence, in memory, and the fractures it leaves behind. The story of the Whittemore family did not end with the ruins of their ranch. It lingered in silence, in the whispers passed down through generations, in the uneasy glance of parents who feared what authority could become behind closed doors. The broken doll, the ledger of mistakes, and the bones beneath the cellar were not just remnants of a single man's cruelty. They were emblems of something older, something that thrives in every society, the willingness of evil to hide beneath masks of normalcy, the capacity of silence to shield the unspeakable. When the remains were unearthed in 1912, the discovery sparked quiet reforms. Officials, disturbed by the evidence, pressed for stricter oversight in schools, orphanages, and homes where discipline had long gone unquestioned. Laws were debated, sermons delivered, articles written in guarded tones. Yet much of the Whittemore history was suppressed, sealed away in records that rarely saw light. To confront it fully would mean admitting how such horrors could unfold not in secret dungeons or foreign battlefields, but in the warm rooms of a family ranch, under the smile of a man admired by neighbors. It was easier, safer to whisper, to warn, to fold the lesson into folklore rather than public history. But folklore carries its own power. Children in the region were warned never to accept a doll passed from generation to generation, never to linger in homes where silence felt too heavy. Parents invoked the Whitmores when disciplining their own, a quiet reminder of what unchecked authority could become. The doll itself became a symbol, a reminder of how innocence could be weaponized, how something meant to comfort could instead bear witness to suffering. Evil does not announce itself with fangs or fire. It creeps in wearing porcelain, smiling gently, promising safety while dismantling everything within. Ruth, the final daughter, never returned to Montana. She lived a life of shadows, carrying scars both visible and invisible. In later years, fragments of testimony surfaced, second-hand accounts of a woman who would not speak above a whisper, who refused to be in rooms with toys, who startled at the faintest creak of a floorboard. She never bore children of her own. Some said it was fear of repeating what had been done to her. Others believed it was her final act of resistance, refusing to extend James Whitmore's bloodline into another generation. When she died, she left behind no journals, no confessions, only silence, a silence that echoed louder than words. Clara's legacy was more ambiguous. Some saw her as complicit, too weak to shield her daughters, too frightened to confront her husband sooner. Others pitied her, a woman broken by years of subtle torture who at the last moment found the courage to end James's reign. Her act of poisoning him was not celebrated but whispered about, as though even in death James's shadow demanded reverence. Yet perhaps her act was the most powerful lesson of all, that evil cannot always be confronted in the open, that sometimes survival requires silence until the moment comes to strike. The Whittemore story lingers not because of its violence, but because of its quiet. There were no public executions, no fiery confrontations, no shouts to alert the town. The horror unfolded in silence in the small rooms of a home, in the ledger's quiet pages, in the porcelain eyes of a doll. That is what makes it terrifying. The recognition that such cruelty does not need spectacle to thrive. It thrives in secrecy and subtlety, in silence that protects it from scrutiny. And it reminds us that the most dangerous evils are not always those that scream, but those that whisper. Today, the ruins of the ranch lie scattered, reclaimed by weeds. The cellar collapsed, the walls rotted. Yet travelers still speak of unease, of being watched, of porcelain fragments glinting in the soil long after they should have dissolved. Whether these are remnants of the past or projections of fear hardly matters. What matters is the reminder. Evil survives when silence prevails, when authority is trusted too blindly, when innocence is used as a mask for cruelty. The Whittemore story forces us to ask difficult questions. How many homes conceal cruelties unseen? How many families bear scars unspoken, legacies of fear buried like bones beneath the floor? Could it happen again? Not in 1876, not in Montana, but here, now, wherever silence protects the powerful and hides the suffering of the vulnerable. The story ends not with James, nor Clara, nor Ruth, but with us. With how we remember, with how we guard against silence, with how we confront the masks behind which cruelty hides. The doll may be gone, its fragments buried, but the lesson it represents remains sharp as porcelain. Evil thrives in silence, and silence is something only we can break.